connection that everybody makes. And I didn't want to sit here and read to you Exodus 19 and Acts chapter 2 and say, go forth and be filled and warmed. So I thought that I would try to, do some research to find some threads that are leading through these passages. And I think that I've got a couple of interesting things that I want to share with you this evening, and then we'll fellowship together. You can see that we have in our little pot there the wheat that we have. I don't know if I told you this, but there's a wheat field literally just a couple miles to the south of us. I was driving with my sons the other day, a couple of weeks back, and saw the wheat field growing and weaving, and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to stop and pluck a couple of those. But you can also buy bundles of those on Amazon for, I think it was $9 to $12 or something like that. So that was a cool thing to put one in there each day as you're counting the omer leading up to the 50th day. And I would like, because I want to bring in a little bit of a metaphor regarding that stalk of grain, I want to make those available to you if you want to grab one and take it with you. They're easy to replace, they're cheap, and I may even go to the field next year and just grab a whole bundle of them. He's not supposed to reap to the corners of his field anyway, right?
That's right. But I'm sure he knows that.
So, I'm sure he knows that. Yeah, he might. You never know. Yes, Jan.
Yes, and if you do that and you would like to keep it fresh and keep it for a while, all you have to do is put hairspray on it.
Hairspray. What did we spray on ours? Was it hairspray? Okay.
It was hairspray or shellac. My mom has some
Okay,
shellac.
yeah.
hairspray really is shellac. Art shellac, I think.
It's pretty much the same thing, right? Yeah, that was, I think we read that, last year. It was like, yeah, you just spray it with something. So that's a great idea. But it was a great, cool tradition that we like. But I want to make them available to you to take one home with you if you'd like. They have been sprayed.
Not all of them.
Ours did not get sprayed?
No.
Okay. Fair enough. It's okay. They're perishable. Nevertheless, have fun with it. So my theme, I suppose, if you were going to call it that, would be to show a transition to maturity that I see running through the scriptures in regards to this theme of Shavuot, Pentecost, okay? So I want to start with this quote. Freedom from slavery comes first, then instruction in what it means to be free and live within the context of a greater community. This is the transition from knowledge to wisdom, the helper who will empower us as we set aside our own interests and become more interested in the needs of others. That's a quote from me. I wanted to put together a thesis statement, that we could weave in around here. So here is Leviticus 23, which is where we get the text that describes for us how you are to celebrate the Feast of Shavuot. And as you guys know, when you read Leviticus 23, and there's a couple of other sections that you can examine in Deuteronomy and such, maybe the books of Nehemiah or Ezra, that talk about the celebration of the feasts of God, you will often be left without much detail. These things are not terribly detailed. And of course, you know that nature abhors a vacuum, so whenever you have a lack of detail, humans will step in and introduce all kinds of analogies and metaphors and fill it up with different things that are traditions. And those traditions are fine and wonderful, and you've seen some of the traditions of the Hebrews, but frankly, we don't have a lot of details in the scriptures regarding how this was done at all. Aside from the scant details that we have here, there's nothing else, except for Jewish traditions that have been going on for thousands of years. But remember also that we haven't had a temple for thousands of years. Yes, please. So even the speculation of the rabbis is based upon writings in the Mishnah and the Talmud, which some of them predate the Messiah Yeshua. But again, it's all just oral tradition. You don't really know exactly what's going on there. But I think that we know, as we study the New Testament scriptures in Greek, that there is a fulfillment of those scriptures and gives us more deeper meaning that, frankly, our Jewish brethren don't have. Make sense? Okay. So let us just briefly read Leviticus 23:15 to, 23 I think it is on the next page, that just runs through real quickly with us the details of Shavuot / Pentecost. Now, what is the difference between Shavuot and Pentecost? Nothing. One's Hebrew, one's Greek. That's right. The spelling, yes. Shavuot in Hebrew and Pentecost in Greek. What does Pentecost mean? It just means 50. Yeah. Thank you. And I have loaves of bread. Now, I'll demonstrate for you later. Now, in Leviticus 23:15, we have this. You will count off for yourselves from the morrow after the Sabbath of unleavened bread. There's some mystery surrounding that as well. From the day you bring the sheaf of the wave offering, there shall be 7 complete Sabbaths. Until the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you will count off 50 days. Then you will bring near an approach present of new grain to Yehovah. And from your dwellings you shall bring bread as a wave offering. 2 loaves of 2/10 of an ephah of flour shall they be, baked with leaven shall they be, as first fruits for Yehovah. And you will bring near with the bread 7 flawless year-old he-lambs, and 1 young bull calf of the herd, and 2 flawless rams. They shall be an ascent offering to Yehovah, together with their approach present and their libations, a fire offering of fragrant odor to Yehovah. And they will offer 1 hairy goat as a sin offering, and 2 year-old he-lambs as a sacrifice of peace offerings. Then the priest will wave them with the bread of the firstfruits as a wave offering before Yehovah, with the 2 he-lambs. Holy shall they be to Yehovah for the priest. And then continuing in 21, and you will proclaim a holy convocation on this very day. It shall be holy for you. You shall do no occupational work at all. It shall be an eternal statute in all of your dwellings throughout your generations. So the Hebrew tradition is, and you've probably seen pictures of some guy in white robes and a helmet of some kind, headdress, holding up 2 loaves, waving them. They how Jews wave things. They like to wave things to the south, and then wave things to the east, and then wave things to the north, and wave things to. Why do they wave them in the 4 directions?
4 winds.
4 winds, perhaps.
Corners of the earth.
The 4 corners of the earth, absolutely. I think that's a good indication. The 4 winds and the 4 corners both seem to speak of God is the provider of plenteousness. Excuse me, is that a word? And He is providing for all mankind in every direction. Okay? That's my understanding of it. Again, this is strictly interpretation and speculation because we frankly don't know. That's the instructions we got right there. Okay, now what I want to do is walk you through a couple of other things to show you some connections that I think are kind of interesting. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to just show you some of the symbolic details of the description that we just got. Okay, the first thing is we have the first fruits of the barley, and then we have Shavuot. Okay, now these are both first fruits gatherings. And there's actually 3, right? There's the first fruits of the barley, there's the first fruits of the wheat, and there's the first fruits of the fruit. So they're all 3 considered first fruits offering, first fruits festivals, so to speak. Yeah. So the details here is that we have the barley harvested, and then you begin a count of 7 complete Sabbaths plus 1 day equals 50. Okay. What do you think of when you see the number 7 in the Bible to begin with? I don't want to get into numerology or gematria or anything, but what does this number 7 represent, Keith? Creation, okay. Completion, absolutely. What's that?
Rest.
Yeah, rest. Those are all really good and strong ideas that I think have biblical support. Now, when you see 7 complete sets of 7, what do you think? That is starting to sound a lot like a Jubilee, which is you're talking about a cycle of completion, seven of those cycles of completion, which is speaking kind of a like fullness, okay? Yeah. And then one more, which goes overboard. It's overflowing, and you also think of the Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day festival after the Feast of Tabernacles, which is like new beginnings, okay? Like the new heavens and the new earth, and I think there's good scriptural evidence to suggest that type of a vision in your mind here. So you've got this 7 complete Sabbath cycles plus 1 day takes you to the 50th day. Then where the wheat crop comes to maturity, the wheat is processed and refined, and 2 loaves are created from this grain. That's what originally got my mind thinking about this process of refinement and growth. Because when you're talking about the barley harvest, you're talking about the waving of these barley stalks. But here you're talking about waving 2 loaves of not only a greater type of grain, of a more rich type, which is wheat, and then you've also got it being processed and refined into loaves, which also includes leaven. Just the only time that something leavened that I'm aware of is brought towards the altar. These are not offered on the altar. That would be inappropriate. However, look at these other couple of details. Number 1, we have a hairy goat for a sin offering, which is not waved before Yehovah. We have 2 lambs for a peace offering, which apparently the shoulders, you notice that language there, shall be waved with or in connection with. You got some type of waving going on with something other than just these 2 loaves, which is never really mentioned much, but you can see in the Hebrew that it's connected some way. That priest is waving something besides these 2 loaves. And the only
Is it cooked meat or raw meat?
No, it's cooked. So what I'm thinking is that he's probably waving the shoulders, because you know that part belongs to the priest, it's part of the offering, so he's going to wave these shoulders as well as the 2 loaves of bread. And then you've got these 2 loaves. So look at what is being waved here. Not waving the sin offering, a peace offering, and 2 loaves. Now what comes to your mind when you think of sin, an offering for sin, an offering to make peace, with 2 loaves? What does that make you think of? Especially in relation to the Messiah Yeshua. Well, it's similar. Tracy?
I'm going to see this whole picture of what the Messiah came to do is to restore the house of Israel into divided houses and make peace between them and the Father.
Yes, that's exactly where my mind went when I began to look at this as a sequence, is that the sin offering is himself. He makes an offering for sin, but you wouldn't wave a sin offering before Yehovah. That would seem inappropriate. An offering is made, but we're not waving it up. Hey, check out this sin. There's something like that. We don't wave representations of sin before God. But the Messiah Yeshua is a sin offering. Paul talks about the making peace, the separation, that peace, bringing the houses back together, peace between the Jews and the Gentiles, peace between the 2 tribes, the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes. And I think that there's a good case to be made that these 2 loaves of bread do represent the houses of Israel. The houses of Israel and the houses of Judah, the Gentiles and the Jews, or both, if you want to connect those things. Okay? And I don't mean both in a figurative sense, I mean both in a literal sense. Like if you're a 2-house theology type of person who says the house of Ephraim is the Gentiles, I think there's a good case to be made for that, and I'm a fan of the proponent, that theme. So these are the things that I see as symbolic details about Shavuot, just in the text of Leviticus itself, okay? Then if we back up, you can see this cycle of development, I think, pretty clearly in the appointed times of Yehovah. You've got 7 of these feasts. Unless you're Keith, you might have 12 or 15. I'm kidding, Keith.
I like as many as I can.
So you got Passover and unleavened bread and first fruits are the first 3, and they're clumped together. Then you've got 50 days later, Shavuot / Pentecost. And then a couple of months after that, you've got these 3 lumped together, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, what I'm looking at here is the barley. This is like a taste of good things to come. This is the food of slaves and poor people and animals. This is not a choice crop in those days. What's that?
Common people.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's more nutritious. It's got a lot more protein. It's not good for making pastry.
Yeah.
It's good for making bread that'll keep you alive.
Yes, and thus poor people, common people. Yeah.
I mean, you can almost live on it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's. I'm not speaking about the nutrition value of barley. I'm speaking about the perception in cultures, because barley bread is not as tasty. We don't think of it in that way. We think of it as, yeah, it's good stuff, it's healthy stuff, but you know that anything that's good and healthy tastes like crap. Hey, I was raised with a mother who liked health food.
Yes, still do.
Yeah, and I just knew that anything that was healthy was not going to taste as good as something that wasn't.
Well, that's the same way with sin.
It's the same way with sin. That's a good point. So, Shavuot comes along with wheat, with these 2 loaves being processed and refined and brought more to maturity. And then the Feast of Trumpets comes along with fruit. Now, fruit is tasty and sweet by itself. And it's even that much better. So you see this progression towards fullness and completion and joy and rest as this cycle goes forward. Now, when you tie that together with the agent of fulfillment, which is Yeshua, we can see him being presaged in these different festivals, with the first one, his execution, the execution of the firstborn, the execution of Yeshua during the Passover. Now, I know that most people lump Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread together, but they're frankly 2 separate things. Now, if you had to, you can really clearly see, even in the Jewish traditions that are kept regarding Passover, if you were here with us for Passover recently, you can see that these traditions that are infused into Passover are just really weighted and loaded towards Yeshua, even if our Jewish brethren and sisters don't see it. But when you look at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, what do you see there as the connection with the Messiah Yeshua? I mean, he's sinless. Okay, he's sinless, unleavened in that way. But is there some other prophetic significance of the fulfillment of unleavened bread as exemplified by Yeshua?
That's when he cleanses his house from sin.
Okay, absolutely. Absolutely. Keith?
The 7th day is a high Sabbath, and that will be when he returns on the 7th day.
Absolutely. Good idea. Good idea. Tracy?
And part of that cleansing his house from sin is removing doctrine of men.
Yes.
It's likened to leaven.
Yep.
And hypocrisy of men.
Yep.
Likened to leaven.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Were you, Keith?
I said that wrong. The 7th millennium.
7th millennium. Yeah. No, I was picking up what you're putting down. Absolutely. Were you going to say something, Jimmy?
I just never made the connection of, I don't know what's wrong with me. It's so clear, the execution of the firstborn of Egypt that would not join into the homes of Jewish families.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if they wanted to go into their home and say, I'm scared.
Save me.
I don't know what to do, but
Yeah.
get me in here.
Sure.
They were safe. And the execution of the firstborn son of God.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I didn't do that. What's wrong with me?
Well, you know something that's interesting? You ever heard of sitting Shiva?
Yeah,
What is that?
The little chair.
it's like a 7-day period. I think it's 7
Mm-hmm.
for mourning.
Yes. It's a 7-day period of mourning.
They cut the chairs are extra low. The legs are cut in half.
They don't wear
So
shoes.
So they sit really low.
They eat kind of bland food. It just occurred to me to throw that in there. You know, I knew you guys would have some good ideas about how this relates to Yeshua, but if you've got a 7-day period right after his execution, it might make sense that this is a period of mourning for the Messiah Yeshua. Can you imagine? Just put yourself in the shoes of the disciples. It says in the scriptures that even until he was raised, they didn't quite understand that even though he told them repeatedly, I'm going to die and rise again. It seems to be after the resurrection when they finally saw it. It was like suddenly it all clicks together and they're like, oh yeah, okay, this makes sense now. But imagine that there might have been a period of mourning from his followers who thought, well, all of our hopes were pinned on that guy, delivering us from the Romans and establishing the kingdom. He kept talking about the kingdom, But it didn't pan out that way, and now he's dead. So it just occurred to me that this might be reflective of a 7-day period of mourning.
That actually makes sense too, because Messiah was telling them, when he's telling them, I'm going to go away and I'm going to come again, he says, you're going to mourn and you're going to be sad.
Yep.
But then joy will come.
Right.
Like a woman
Right.
in labor.
Yep, absolutely. So that's just an interesting idea. And then first fruits, where you take the first fruits of the barley and you wave them, we know the significance of that, right? That they're taking these first few ripe grains of barley and waving them just like that in 4 directions. That he is the first fruits of those raised from the dead. And so these 3 festivals are fulfilled in wonderful prophetic significance going back thousands of years. So this is really spectacular stuff. And then you've got your 50-day count where you're counting the Omer, and you get spiritual food. If you want to look at the revelation at Sinai, I would say perhaps you're getting spiritual food and it's being implanted in your mind. Then in Shavuot, as the development comes in fulfillment, the spiritual food is being planted in your heart. You know the difference between something being planted in your mind and planting in your heart, right? It's like head knowledge, that's the development from knowledge to wisdom. And I don't think, a lot of people don't really understand what wisdom is. I did a study with my kids a few years ago about wisdom, and somebody thinks of wisdom as just being, I'm wise, I know a lot of things. Knowledge and wisdom are very different. I think that the best way that I could describe it would be to say that wisdom means knowing the right thing to do and doing it. Knowledge is knowing the difference and having discernment. Knowledge and discernment is knowing the difference between right and wrong. It doesn't mean you're going to do it necessarily. That's what James would call a double-souled man, who has the difference between good and evil, but is more inclined to do what he wants, while asking God for help and guidance. This is the double-souled man. But a man who has wisdom, the wisdom which comes down from above, not the wisdom which comes down from below, which is earthly and demonic, says, I know the right thing to do, and I will do it. Carla.
I kind of look at that as knowledge is knowing what, but wisdom is knowing how to apply it.
Good. Yeah.
Especially in your own life.
Sure.
But
Yeah, having the wisdom to apply the head knowledge and to actually go ahead and take those steps and do so. Absolutely. And so I see, because what Shavuot is representing over time is that on the very first Shavuot, and I know that this is a big confusion in the church, for example, that we think Pentecost came and the church was established and this is some new thing. It's not new. This festival has been celebrated for at least 1,400 years before Yeshua came, and this is not unprecedented. As any of you who have read the ancient rabbinic commentaries on when God spoke from Mount Sinai, you know there's some very interesting little tidbits in there, and I'm going to read you one in a second, which I think you'll find quite fascinating. But when they leave Egypt and they're traveling through the wilderness, 50 days later they arrive at Mount Sinai, and God speaks. They receive the instructions. Just like I told you in my opening statement, you're coming out of slavery, you're getting instructions on what it means between right and wrong and how to live in a community, and growing towards maturity and learning to understand your neighbor's needs are just as important or more important than your own. So we're moving from the spiritual food of God, the Word of God, being implanted in the mind at Mount Sinai and implanted in the heart on Mount Moriah in the temple in the time of Yeshua. Okay, so the next development of this process, and now we're going forward in history, in time, because Yeshua has not yet fulfilled these next 3 feasts. The Feast of Trumpets is the calling of Israel together, which I think clearly representing the resurrection and the return of the Messiah. You've got the Day of Atonement, which I think represents the throne judgment, separating the sheep and the goats. And then you've got the Feast of Tabernacles, where the kingdom is established and Yeshua is tabernacling with God for 1,000 years, and then God himself comes down and tabernacles with mankind forevermore. Okay, so there's your quick development of the 7 feasts of God and how they are reflected in Yeshua. Now, if you go to the next step, I want to just review with you briefly by a couple of select passages this very first Shavuot, the very first Pentecost that we see in Exodus 19. In Exodus 19, verse 14, it says this, Moshe went down from the mountain to the people and separated the people for God, and they washed their clothing. And he said to the people, prepare for the 3rd day, don't approach a woman. On the morning of the 3rd day, there was thunder, lightning, and a thick cloud on the mountain. Then a shofar, a trumpet blast, sounded so loudly that all the people in the camp trembled. And Moshe brought the people out of the camp to meet God. They stood near the base of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was enveloped in smoke because Yehovah descended onto it in fire. Its smoke went up like the smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain shook violently. As the sound of the shofar grew louder and louder, Moshe spoke, and God answered him with a voice. Now here's some interesting stuff right here, skipping down to the next section, Exodus 20, verse 18. It says, all of the people experienced the sound. This translation says they experienced the thunder. What it literally says in the Hebrew is they saw the sounds, which is really unusual.
How would you see a sound?
That's a good question. How do you see the sounds? The lightning, the sound of the shofar, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled, and standing at a distance, they said to Moses, you speak with us, but we will listen. But don't let God speak with us anymore, we will die. And so Moses answered the people, don't be afraid, because God has come only to test you and to make you fear him so that you won't commit sin. So the people stood at a distance, but Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Now this is the first Shavuot. Now what's quite fascinating is when you look at Shemot Rabbah, basically it's just a commentary. You guys all have commentaries, I'm assuming. I've got plenty of it, Walvoord and Zuck and the Good Speed and all these different commentaries on the Bible. Well, the Mishnah and the Talmud are nothing more than Jewish commentaries on the Old Testament. And so this is what is written in Shemot Rabbah, the commentary from the Jews, in Shemot Rabbah 5:9. It says this, the Lord came from Sinai and shone from Seir in the east to them, and it is written in Habakkuk 3:3, and God will come from Teman in the south, and it is stated in Exodus 20:15, all the people saw the sounds, literally voices, as it is not written sound here, but rather sounds. Rabbi Yochanan said the voice would go out and divide into 70 voices for the 70 languages, so that all the nations would hear, and each and every nation would hear in their own language. That is a commentary on this passage going back a long, long ways. Okay? Now, what does that sound like to you? That is the book of Acts. That is the book of Acts. It's quite fascinating. Now,
What was that? I'm sorry. What was that from?
that was from the Shemot Rabbah 5:9. You can find that on Sephariah.com. It's got a Hebrew translation and an English translation.
Legends of the Jews.
That's right. Now, in case you missed that first bit of foreshadowing, this is repeated in the book of Numbers. Not the same episode, a different episode. In Numbers, we have the people lusting after flesh. Interesting that it's the mixed multitude who is lusting after flesh. They're saying, who's going to give us stuff to eat? And remember the fish in Egypt and the garlic and the leeks and all this stuff. Now, here's what it says. In verse 16, Numbers 11:16, it says, Yehovah said to Moses, do gather to me 70 elders from the men from the elders of Israel, of whom you know that they are elders of the people and their superintendents, and make them Take them to the tent of meeting, that they station themselves there with you. I will descend and speak with you there, and I will divert some of the spirit which is on you and place it on them. They will bear the load of the people with you, so that you are not bearing it by yourself alone. And to the people you will say, sanctify yourselves for the morrow, when you will eat flesh. For you lamented in the ears of Yehovah, saying, who will give us flesh to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Now Yehovah will give you flesh, and you will eat. Now, what's interesting is you continue reading that passage, it again talks about 3 days of self-sanctification. Washing your clothes, washing yourself, and abstaining from sexual contact. Hit Kadesh. Same exact concept and word used between these two passages. An interesting concept, Hit Kadesh. I encourage you to remember that and write it down. Make yourself holy. It's very interesting stuff.
Hallel means
pray.
To pray.
Yeah. Fascinating, isn't it? Yeah. We'll talk about that. So now in verse 24, we've skipped down just a bit, it says that Moses went forth and spoke to the people the words of Yehovah, and he gathered 70 men from the elders of the people and stood them around the tent. And then Yehovah descended in a cloud and spoke to him. He caused some of the spirit which was on him to divert, and he put it on the 70 men, the elders. And it came to be, as the spirit rested on them, that they prophesied. And they did not do so again. Yet 2 men remained in the camp. The name of the one was Eldad, and the name of the second Medad. The Spirit also rested on them. Now, they had been among those listed, but had not gone forth towards the tent. Yet they prophesied in the camp. And now a young man ran and told Moses and said, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. And Yeshua, the son of Nun, the minister of Moses, from his prime, answered and said, my lord Moses, stop them. Yet Moses said to him, are you zealous for my sake? Oh, that all of the people of Yehovah were prophets, for Yehovah put his spirit on them. Isn't that fascinating? Another presaging of the fulfillment of this passage, this festival of Shavuot. Now, what's most curious about this is, you know, that in the Hebrew, when you see that word prophesying, it's literally an ecstatic utterance. This is what literally is translated as, an ecstatic utterance. Now, you can interpret that in a lot of different ways, but doesn't that sound a whole lot like speaking in tongues in the book of Acts? It kind of does to me. But I don't have time to go into a whole lot of detail here in regards to these 2 men who remained in the camp. But there's something very interesting and significant going on with 70 elders, 2 of them remaining in the camp and prophesying in the camp. Just make a note to yourself in that regard, because I think that those 2 men who remained in the camp there's something special about them. You might also look at their names in Hebrew, Eldad and Medad, and that might give you some clue about what is going on with these guys. So think about that. Make some notes to yourself regarding checking out these 2 men who remained in the camp and prophesied. And also you've got Yeshua, the son of Nun, who is a wonderful prophetic example of the Messiah Yeshua, who is being zealous for Moses. But just quite fascinating here. There's something very, very interesting about this section. Now, the question is, why did God put his spirit on these 70 elders? Keith.
So they could assist Moshe, because he had a lot of responsibility.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that ties in really well with what I am proposing to you, this whole theme of being servants to each other. And that this empowerment of the Spirit is because Moses does have a lot of responsibility on himself, and he is kind of freaking out and is basically saying, you know, if you read the remainder of that section, I'd kind of jumped ahead to verse 24, but you can see him saying, you know, did I give birth to these people? Why are you weighing me down with these people? These are not my people. I can't put up with these people. So yes, it is very true that a servant of Yehovah, a servant of Yeshua, if he is not helped and have people come up alongside him, he can be beat down. It's a lot of work to
The load is to be shared.
be a flock, to shepherd a flock. And that's, we need each other for encouragement and strength and support. And I think that, God giving the Torah to a group of slaves who you have heard of examples, even in the American South here, when the slaves got their freedom in the American South, they didn't know what to do with themselves. It's like, well, now I'm free. Oh, great. What do I do now? My master used to feed me and clothe me, and he gave me, work for my hands to do. Yeah, I got beat every once in a while, and it definitely wasn't a good life, but at least I knew where my next meal was coming from, and I had a purpose in life, was to work. I didn't get treated well, but at least there was something in my life that gave it stability and meaning. It was as such as it was. But yeah, you take 2 to 3 million people and you set them free from Egypt, and they have no idea what to do. And now you give them a set of instructions that says, okay, here's what you need to do personally, and here's what you need to do corporately in order to form a society for yourselves that are going to be reflective of my character and not the character of the place that you came from. So this is exactly why God took the spirit that was in Moses and diverted it to these 70 elders so they could share the burden, so that they could serve each other. Okay, as we're getting ready to teach these people to begin serving each other on a much lower level, so that we're not continuously rising up towards Moses and complaining and saying, hey, we need somebody to help us. Keith?
Isn't that something that you find common in today's assemblies or congregations, where you'll have the pastor or the rabbi, and then there'll be elders?
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
Shoulder the load and spiritually help other people, and he doesn't have to.
Yep, absolutely.
Be trodden down.
Absolutely.
It basically boils down to implementing, what one man was given to give implementation to a lot of people.
Yeah.
So that it can incorporate unity and things in order, so things can happen the way they're supposed to.
Yeah. The God is a God of order, and He's a God of people caring for people. It's definitely all tying together real nicely. It's about becoming mature. It's about the people of God starting off in infancy and moving towards maturity. Angela?
I wanted to address the 70 number
Please.
right there, unless you were going to say something.
I was just about to, but carry on.
Well, that 70 number, if you've been studying, makes you think of the 70 nations, right? The table of nations.
Yep.
So, back in Genesis, when you have this table of nations, where you have the 70 first associated with that kind of concept, that's also when He dispersed everyone by separating their language at the Tower of Babel. And what's interesting is in Acts, you have now the language being restored, where they're all speaking but understanding. So it's almost like we're moving back towards restoration. And what is the restoration? It's restoring not just the Jews to God, it's restoring all the nations, the entire earth.
Yep, absolutely.
The Sanhedrin is supposed to be composed of enough men that they can all speak Hebrew, obviously, but corporately they can all speak the 70 languages.
Mm-hmm.
So one would speak French and one German and one English.
Interesting.
So that they can communicate with the people. And the other thing is that you've got the number 7 there, and you've got the number 10. 7 is the completion of godly stuff, and 10 seems to be, because we have 10 fingers and 10 toes, our ability to work as humans.
Mm.
And our deeds and our walk.
10
And
hands, 10 words.
Yeah.
And so you've got that combining of perfection and doing.
The yod is the 10th letter, and it's the symbol of a
The
hand.
hand doing work.
It means
A
doing.
working hand.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
And then Zephaniah talks about restoring a pure language in that day or something like that.
Yep.
So I think that's
It's almost like the corruption going all the way to Babylon is being undone and restored. And at the end of the Bible, in the book of the Revelation of the Messiah, you see Babylon crumbling and the establishment of God's kingdom. Angela?
I think maybe that's what it took to make it fill the whole earth, because if you read the reason why they were building in Babylon was lest we be scattered. But he had just told them a couple chapters before that
To scatter.
which was Adam and Eve. He said, go fill the earth. So then at Babylon, they're like, we don't want to be scattered. We want to all stick together. And he split their language, scattered them. Now you have the coming back together in Acts, where the language is being restored and the whole thing has filled the earth.
Yep, absolutely.
They're speaking in tongues.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. So now we will move forward just a little bit to Yeshua. After the death of Yeshua and his resurrection, we have the book of Acts. Okay, so now if you go to Acts chapter 2, we have some very interesting things. And before we read this, I just want to bring your attention to the first sentence in the book of Acts chapter 2, where it says, now when the festival of Shavuot had fully arrived. Now I was struck by that as I was reading this, and I thought, why does it say that Shavuot had fully arrived? And you know, if you look at that in the Greek, what it says, and in the filling up of the days of Pentecost, the filling up is sumplerao. Sumplerao. Now, when the festival of Shavuot had fully arrived, where have you heard that word plerao before?
Come to fill up your joy, and come to fulfill the law. It's the same word.
It's the same words that Yeshua used in Matthew 5:17, where he says, do not think that I came to do away with the Torah of Moses. I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill. It's plerao. It's the exact same word. To fill, full of meaning, to bring to its fullness. This is the bringing to its fullness of the mystery of the festival of Shavuot. That is why Luke wrote it that way. I'm convinced that he says, when Shavuot had fully arrived. He could have said it so many different ways. Oh, hey, Shavuot arrived, and this is what happened. Yeah. He said, when it had fully come. This is the fulfillment of that.
You know, and just as we do it, and in counting the Omer and reading Psalm 119, you know, it's all about the Torah, and just getting you excited, because you know the giving of it, as in our, in the history, it's coming. So to me, that 50th day is like, it's here, yay, it's exciting, and the Omer is fulfilled. Yep, too.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's like popcorn.
It's like popcorn.
You've got the ones that aren't popped, and they're pop, and when they all have finally popped.
Now, what do you, before I read this, and we see
it's complete.
All the kernels are popped. So before I read this, I want to ask you, and this is where some confusion comes in, I think, on the part of our Jewish brethren who are celebrating this festival of Shavuot. What is their tradition regarding the festival of Shavuot? Does anyone know? What do Jews do on Shavuot?
Read the Torah.
Oh, they eat dairy.
No?
Dairy products.
No?
They eat dairy products.
Well, they might. Yeah, that could be.
They read Ruth.
They read the book of Ruth.
That's right.
Isn't this the one where they stay up all night, though?
Yeah, and read the Torah the night before.
Okay, Angela. Go ahead.
I was wondering this whole time why that verse was there.
When
What?
you're reading Leviticus, it has the Passover, First Fruits, Pentecost, trumpets, Day of Atonement. But in Pentecost, did you guys notice there was one last verse when he read that?
You
that
shall
said,
not reap
"When
to the
you reap,
edges."
Don't reap to the corner of your field.
Okay. That's about Ruth.
Yeah, now I think that, and that is a Jewish tradition, is on Shavuot to read the book of Ruth. It's a fabulous tradition, and I think that there's some interesting tie-ins, because you can see in the book of Ruth you have a couple of really strong messianic links. Okay, you've got the lineage of King David, the line of the Messiah is established in the book of Ruth. You've got a person converting from paganism to worshiping the true God. There's no circumcision, there's no rituals of any kind. It's, I renounce my heritage, I renounce the place of my birth, I renounce my people, I renounce the gods of my fathers. Wherever you go, I'm going. Wherever you die, I'm dying, where your people are my people. That is a conversion to the worship of the holy God. And a Moabite at that. That's right. That's right. Now, and then you've got the idea of this grain and the kinsman redeemer, Boaz. It's full of really fascinating things. However, you also have the dual significance attached to Shavuot from the perspective of Judaism of this is the day that the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, but they don't do anything in regards to that. There's nothing that I'm aware of in their traditions, symbolisms or anything like that. They say this is the day that the Torah came, and yet they read the book of Ruth. They're not tying these things together, at least in my estimation.
But they will, because
But-
the days will come where they're going to be like, that's why we're reading Ruth.
Yes.
Because Messiah says at this time, go out and preach me, testify about me into all of Judea, Judah, all Samaria, Israel, and to the ends of the earth, which are the nations.
Right.
So you don't reach the edges of your fields, because that's for the Gentiles. That's what Ruth is all about.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Leave
So,
something for them.
yeah, and I think that when they do come to the knowledge of the Messiah Yeshua, they'll read the book of Acts, probably for the first time, and they'll say, just like we did not too long ago, I'm so sorry that we missed this. I'm so sorry that we missed this. How did we miss this stuff?
Don't be sorry for the way it ended.
Yeah. Yeah.
At least we're not totally done.
Absolutely. So let's read this together. In Acts chapter 2, it says, Now when the festival of Shavuot had fully arrived, and the believers all gathered together in one place, suddenly there came a sound from the sky like the roar of a violent wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Then they saw what looked like tongues of fire, which separated and came to rest on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in different languages as the Spirit enabled them to speak. And then it says, if you continue in verse 41, I want to kind of bring this in here because this kind of shows the continuance of that theme. So those who accepted what Peter had preached were immersed, and they were added to the group that day, about 3,000 people, and they continued faithfully in the teaching of the emissaries, the apostles, in fellowship, in breaking bread, and in the prayers. Everyone was filled with awe, and many miracles and signs took place through the emissaries. All those trusting in Yeshua stayed together and had everything in common. In fact, they sold their property and possessions and distributed the proceeds to all who were in need. Continuing faithfully and with single-mindedness of purpose to meet in the temple courts daily and breaking bread in their several homes, they shared their food in joy and simplicity of heart, praising God and having the respect of all the people. And day after day, the Lord kept adding to them those who were being saved. That's why I stuck this section in there, because I think that this shows you what is the result of this. Yeah. When the Spirit came, it did many things, obviously. It gave them great courage to speak this word amidst great persecution and an adversarial relationship with those around them. But you can see what the immediate result is. People are being rescued and saved. They're coming together with a great sense of unity, of fellowship. They're breaking bread together. They're praying together. They're selling their properties in case anybody has a need, to help each other. This is the fulfillment of loving your neighbor as yourself. This is what it all adds up to. Not just reading your Bible and praying, because you've heard me say this before. Should we read our Bibles and pray? Absolutely. You'll be starving to death and you won't know what to do if you don't have the knowledge. You have to have the knowledge. But I think that we sometimes get caught up in the idea And throughout my whole Christian life, I've known men and women who have, whatever you want to call it, backslidden, have kind of let things go by the wayside. And what they usually will say is, I haven't been praying very much and reading my Bible very much, and I need to get back into that, and absolutely you should. But I think sometimes we get into the mindset of, I need to read my Bible and pray more, when really what you need to do is engage more. You already have enough truth. Live it. Because if you're not living it, then it's worthless. You know what I'm saying? That's what James, the brother of Jesus, tells us. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to point to James there.
I'm not that guy.
So, I think any of us know the Scriptures. We were raised in it from our youth. Yes, we're growing deeper in our knowledge, and we need that knowledge, and we need to keep immersing and washing in the water of the Word. Don't hear me say that that's not important. But what's more important than hearing the Word? Doing it.
It's about works.
It's a combination of faith and works, just like the book of James tells us.
Faith is something you adhere to and hold on to.
Faith is something that happens to you that you don't deserve, almost like being being pulled out of Egypt and saved.
I think faith has to start first. If
Absolutely.
I don't have faith in something,
Yeah.
then this grace means nothing to me.
That's right.
So if I have the faith first, I trust in Jesus as my Lord and Savior, and His grace is sufficient, then my works will exemplify His life to others, so they can join in with what He offered us.
You would certainly hope so. If not, then there's something wrong.
And that's what I think James says, by works, faith is made perfect or complete.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think that we can also look at it in a broader sense, that sometimes grace comes first.
Always grace
Sometimes
comes first.
Mercy comes before faith.
Always.
Sometimes mercy and grace leads us to faith.
I think I don't think sometimes, I think always. I think you're right that that's the case always. You would not have faith unless God was merciful to you. And we can see in our Bibles all over that the faith that you hold is a gift from God.
Yes,
and that is by grace. That is by grace. So that the grace and the mercy always comes first. That gives you that faith. Once you have that, it's now your task. It's like being on a basketball court. If somebody throws you that ball, you can't just stand there with it.
You can't give someone something that you don't possess.
Yeah. Jim?
Boaz was kind to Ruth, and then Ruth said, let's do this.
Let's do this.
And the cool thing is that he was really, really old, and he was the president of the Sanhedrin. And
That's not in the Bible, by the way.
the night of their marriage was his last day alive, because the Moabite women were supposed to have this power. And,
Also not in the Bible.
And she
are you reading this in the Legends of the Jews, Jimmy?
No, it's in all kinds of stuff. She loved him to death, and she got pregnant that night.
Loved him to death.
Yeah.
That's funny.
He was really, really old, and she was a Moabitess with all this power.
That's funny. Powerful woman. Was somebody else having their hand up? Jimmy, Keith, were you going to say something,
I
buddy?
was just going to say something related on, we were talking about grace and stuff like that. But yeah, if you're trying to witness to somebody and they don't, so they sort of believe in God, but they don't understand God's commandments and understand that they are a sinner, and they don't believe they're a sinner, then they don't need a Savior. But if they understand they have sinned, then they have a need for the Savior, our Savior, and then you can make a connection.
Sure. And I would it would be hard for me to say that there's a wrong way to share the gospel. But there's certainly you can screw people up by giving them bad information. Do they need Jesus? Yes, they do. And just as Paul said, hey, I want to see Jesus preached. There are people who are preaching Jesus with envy and strife in his day. I mean, he's like, I'm sure he wouldn't prefer that, but he says only that he's preached. That's what I want. Tracy?
I like what you had said a few weeks ago about how preaching preaching the gospel is like basically witnessing what he's done for you in your life, because that's
Right.
just so true.
It's so much more powerful than...
It is. When you can just say, listen, I went through something like
Yeah.
what you're going
Yeah.
through. This is what happened to me, and look where I am now. And it's not because of anything I did,
Right.
other than coming to
Absolutely.
the Father through the Son and
Yeah.
saying, I'm a sinner, help me.
Yes. You know that stories are, as you can tell from the Bible and the parables of Yeshua, that stories are powerful instruments for sharing truth. And your personal story is going to be much more powerful than saying, let me share with you something that I read.
Yes.
It's not quite as powerful as let me share with you something that happened to me. You know, that's much more powerful.
That's head knowledge versus heart.
That's
We're
experiential.
not commissioned to go out and save people. We're commissioned to go out and make disciples out of people.
That's
I think
true.
Something we miss too is teaching them how to seek the Father, how to study. That's
Yeah.
what we're supposed to be doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So,
No, we're supposed to get them to walk forward and say something, whisper something in the pastor's ear, and get back to us.
I'm like, yes.
yes, no. So the purpose and the program of the feasts. Remember that these feasts are commanded by God. They are not salvific. You can't get saved by observing the Sabbath and observing the feasts. Might be evidence that you have a changed heart, but remember that. There is a pattern of growth here. Also, the pattern is that we go from physical salvation to spiritual salvation, always. Okay? We also have the transition from Egypt to Mount Sinai. We have the transition from 49 to 50. Okay? This is the same concept as Shemini Atzeret. And we have the transition from head knowledge to heart wisdom, and this growth. We are supposed to be followers, faithful disciples of Yeshua the Messiah at the end of the ages. Let us stand up and do what we're supposed to do, because I want him to say, well done, good and faithful servant, not, get away from me, you wicked slave. That's not what we want to hear. And so, what is the purpose of these things? To love and serve and to live for one another. Because Yeshua said in John 15:8, this is how my Father is glorified, and you are bearing much fruit. This is how you will prove to be my disciples. Just as my Father has loved me, I too have loved you, so stay in my love. If you keep my instructions, you will stay in my love, just as I have kept my Father's instructions and abide and stay in his love. I have said this to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you keep on loving each other just as I have loved you. No one has a greater love than a person who lays down his life for his friends.
Also, what ties in nicely with this is that basically he's telling you, when I come again, I'm looking for fruit.
Yep.
And that's these last feast days are the fruit harvest.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So this is the fruit. You know, you can look through in Corinthians and some of Paul's other writings and see, what are the fruits of the Spirit? Yeah, there are personal fruits of the Spirit, and love, joy, and peace, and patience, and kindness, and gentleness, and wisdom. But how are those things expressed towards others? It's not that you have a self-love. You're not patient with yourself. This isn't about self-esteem. This is about you loving your neighbor as yourself.
And I've been doing a lot of study on what this fruit is, like in the Old Testament, and I've discovered time and time again it is described as justice, mishpatim, and righteousness, tzedakah.
Yep.
These are the fruits that he's looking for.
That's right. Absolutely
Justice
right.
and righteousness.
Absolutely right. I'm pretty confident that that's all I have for you.
Good stuff. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
good.
Good stuff, right,
Good
Jan?
stuff.
Feel it, Jan?
Thanks for sharing from
You
the
feel it, Jan?
Well, I don't want to sound oblivious, and I don't want to, because you guys are very cognitive, and I appreciate that, and I'm very in the moment, and you know that.
Hold it. Before you continue speaking, let me say something. You're going to find that there's a lot of people in this fellowship who are very heady, and there are people who are, who are more about engaging and having interpersonal relationships than knowing a lot of stuff. Both are needed. But what I will say is, yes, you are correct. This is a fairly heady congregation of a bunch of smart people who like talking about the Bible. And I'm not saying we're all talkers. Don't hear me say that. But what I am saying is you could sometimes get the impression this is a bunch of people, just smart people who like to talk about the mysteries of the Bible. It might seem that way. I totally understand that.
Just an end, though, because you ended with the fruit of the Spirit, which is very heartfelt.
Sure.
And then you ended with justice and righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like either one of you to do the blend, because obviously they're both important, extremely important.
Typically,
You know, and that is some.
And you ended there, and you ended there, and we're kind of like this, right? And
That's a good observation. That's a good observation, and I think that is something, and that ties in so wonderfully with this talk that we've had this evening about the Spirit. And my whole point would be that is the Spirit moving us in the direction of being able to blend those things, because only God, I'm sure that you've heard this before in rabbinic teachings, that God is the only one who is able to perfectly balance mercy and justice.
Well, I guess I'm having trouble following you, because I think that's what the fruit of the Spirit is.
Yes.
Because he's talking about how you treat other people with his justice, his judgments, and his righteousness.
Right.
And this is exemplified in the fruit of the Spirit and how we produce those things.
And I think that what Jan might be asking about, and I don't think she's looking at you and saying, "Oh, I'm feeling love and peace and joy on one hand, and judgment and righteousness on the other."
See, that's not what justice is.
No, and I think that might be the misunderstanding is that when we're saying righteousness and judgment, we're talking about being righteous and judging yourself rightly in order to walk in the love of God, walking uprightly in a way that is not a holiness thing where it's like, I'm doing this and you're not. That's not the point, at least I hope not. The point is we have to, as we talked about early on in this little study, that concept of Hit Kadesh, purifying yourself. There's not for no reason that, and you know, of course, if you've studied anything about the historicity of the Jews and their pilgrim festivals, every one of those people went through a mikvah to go up onto that Temple Mount, the baptism. They got baptized when they were going up onto that Temple Mount. That is part of this self-sanctification process. Now, there are two parts to that. There's a self-sanctification process, which is a preparation of the heart. But then there's the God righteousness, which is the salvation part of it, which you can do nothing. But you've got to have both. And that's, I think, what we're talking about is combining the purification and the walking uprightness of yourself.
Working out your salvation.
Working out your salvation. Yes.
And my husband and I are just recently, in the past week, have decided to enter into that study on our own, because with the way that he was raised and I was raised, even though that we've done a lot of different ministry groups and ministry and all this, we have come to understand that being Christ-like may mean something different to the two of us.
Yeah, that's very
so
true.
I think combining what you said and what you said, and what
hopefully it's a little bit of a more complete picture, I hope, to be able to combine those things.
Is my search.
Yeah. And I think that comes from a lot of different traditions. Of certain people have a religious background which is more about experiences and about experiencing this sense of fellowship. Others were more from, how do I say?
Being Christ-like is making a whip out of 3 cords and purging the temple. That is being Christ-like.
Sorry, Tracy, go.
I just wanted to kind of explain a little bit, just because to get a bigger understanding of what we're supposed to be doing, or what God placed Israel in Jerusalem to do, is to shine a light for all nations, to come and receive righteous judgments, receive God's word as it was meant to be. But they didn't do that. So in Isaiah 5, he says, I came looking for good fruit, but instead I found rotten fruit.
Yep.
And then he compares that to what that means. I
Yeah.
came
Or
looking
no
for
fruit.
judgment and righteousness,
Yeah.
but instead I found bloodshed and a cry for help.
Yeah.
You were oppressing people. You were killing people. You weren't giving them my word. You weren't giving them my judgment and my righteousness. That's the good fruit
Sure.
I'm looking for.
Yeah.
It's how we treat it. Is all about how we treat others and what we're giving them. We're giving them God's word as a light to shine to draw them to Him.
Yep.
So,
Absolutely.
It's all
Thank
connected.
you.
Yeah. Trying to be balanced, having a good balance, and I think that we can do that. If you've got the Spirit of God indwelling you, then you should be able to evince some of those characteristics of God inside of you as it's flowing out. You know, you should be able to balance the whip of cords and the loving your brother as yourself.
It's not as bad as you made it sound.
No, I know, I'm kidding. I know. Anyway, anything else for the good of the order? Let's fellowship and pray together.